Welcome back to the channel. I'm sure some of you missed me last week. Well, I'm still recovering from foot surgery, and this week we're going to sort of follow the doctor's orders. Sort of. What I mean by that is we're going to do something that doesn't require a lot of standing, and what better way to spend an afternoon is to do a transmission autopsy. So on the bench, we have a non-world-class T5 transmission out of a 1989 Chevy S10 pickup. Now, before we get into this, let me tell you the backstory about this sorry little transmission. So way back in June of last year, we picked up this dilapidated Chevy S10 pickup. These square body S10s are hard to find, and this was the best we could get for a few $100. Anyway, the truck ran fine, but it didn't move. However, when we jacked up the truck and got the back wheels off the ground, we could put the transmission into gear and the wheels would spin. So to us, it looked like the clutch was likely worn out. Next, out came the engine and transmission, and we immediately had a look at the clutch assembly. Needless to say, the clutch was smoked. Now, clutches wear out, so that's not too concerning. Although, with 174,000 miles, this truck was on its second clutch. And that's definitely possible, depending on how much abuse the truck was exposed to. Although, typically, a clutch pretty much should outlast the vehicle. Well, here in Kansas, we ain't got a lot of stop-and-go traffic, and that's more or less the case. Of course, the previous owner did say the truck had a bad transmission, so that's a clue that I completely ignored. Anyway, we figured the bad clutch was what the previous owner was talking about when he said the truck had a bad transmission. It seemed reasonable. Fast forward a few months, and after some much needed rust repair and a diesel engine transplant, which included a brand new clutch, the S10 was ready for its first drive. Well, not more than 20 feet from the shop, the transmission popped out of first gear, so this was concerning. Anyway, after some more driving, it was confirmed that the gearbox wouldn't stay engaged in first gear. So it's all starting to make sense. The reason the clutch was burned out was the previous owner was using second gear to take off. Using second gear to get a truck rolling is certainly possible, but it puts a huge load on the clutch and will cause premature failure. Long story, a little bit shorter. We picked up a good used T5 transmission and replaced the sickly one so we could move ahead with the project. Fast forward a few months, and we're finally ready to dig into this gearbox and see what's causing it to pop out of first gear. So, full disclosure, I make YouTube videos, I fiddle with electronics, and I write code. Transmission repair is not one of my areas of expertise. Now, despite the fact that I'm not an expert in transmissions, I do have decent mechanical skills. After all, I did put a diesel engine in this truck. Now, what I'm saying is, I can definitely take this transmission apart, but I may need some help by the real experts in the audience once we start looking at the individual parts. So, the real experts who may be watching, get ready to have an opinion. Today, we're looking for a reason why this transmission keeps popping out of first gear. So this transmission was made by Borg Warner. The Borg people were out of control in my opinion, and they were famous for saying, "We are Borg and you will be assimilated. Oh, and resistance is futile." Or something like that. Ironically, the Borg were assimilated by Tremec in the 90s, and the T5 transmission continued to be produced. However, it was slightly redesigned and it became known as the World-Class T5. World-Class T5s are more robust and are very good transmissions. This guy is a non-World-Class T5, and it's a product of the Borg people. So, when talking about T5 transmissions, it's important to distinguish whether they're world-class or non-world-class. Yeah, I know, it's a crazy story, and it seems like it should be on an episode of Star Trek. Anyway, we have a table full of common tools because the non-world-class gearbox doesn't really require any specialized tools to disassemble. Alright, well, we have a Robot Cantina exclusive tip for separating the bell housing from the gearbox. You see, this front bearing support is made of steel, and over time, oxidization will occur, and the bell housing can be extremely difficult to remove. This bolt on the upper right-hand side of the transmission can be used as a jack bolt. Now, the trick is to remove the other 3 bolts that hold the gearbox to the bell housing, and then on this last bolt, use a standard size 15mm socket and an extension, then back this bolt out until the socket comes in contact with the gearbox case. At that point, continue backing out the bolt. The bolt will actually apply pressure to the bell housing, and that'll break the bond between the steel bearing support and the aluminum bell housing. Now, on the bench, there are other ways to separate these 2 parts, but if you're under a truck like in a junkyard, and trying to remove just the gearbox without the bell housing, this trick will pop the gearbox right off the bell housing without any drama. So this bell housing's been off the transmission recently, and we really didn't need to do this trick. However, due to the tight tolerances between this part and the bell housing, plus some oxidization, it can be extremely difficult to separate these two parts. Next, I need to punch this pin out. There we go. The bolts holding the tail shaft housing to the transmission case were loosened off camera, and all I need to do is zip them out now. The bolts apparently have some sort of thread locker or sealant on them. I reckon that's good to know if this transmission ever gets reassembled. Whoop, this is the tag for the transmission. I reckon the transmission nerds want to decode this, so there you go. And now I can bop the tail shaft housing with this dead blow hammer. You know, there's always going to be a hammer for every job. I think I have at least 10 hammers in the toolbox, and each one has its purpose. This guy should really slide out, but we'll have to give it a few bumps to encourage it to move. Now, apparently, it's very important to account for this pin. You see, you need to physically hold it in your hand before moving forward. The reason is, this pin may still be stuck in the gizmo, and during reassembly, if you drive a new pin on top of the old pin, you pretty much destroyed the transmission. Because the only way to fix this is to cut the tail housing off the gearbox. Apparently, people have done this in the past. Now right here is where a thrust washer may get stuck, and that's not the case, so we need to look for the thrust washer. Well, the thrust washer and the bearing are still attached to the cluster shaft, so that's good. This plastic gizmo is very important, and it's best not to break it. Now we can finally take the cover off the case. So over here is the pry point you can use to separate the cover from the case. The cover first needs to go in this direction, and then you can lift it right off. Okay, this is the first and second gear shift fork, and this is the third and fourth gear shift fork. The good news is these plastic thingies are still in place. However, it looks like there's some wear on this side of the fork. Well, the worn out side is for second gear engagement. The fork will move this way for first gear, and the pressure would be on this side of the fork and the plastic bushing. For second gear, the fork moves in this direction and the pressure would be on this side of the bushing. Since our issue was the transmission popping out of first gear, I'm not sure if this is our problem. What do the experts think? Now, I definitely think these doohickeys need to be replaced no matter what, but I don't think this is our problem. So at this point, without the tail shaft housing, well, there's no pressure holding the rear bearing races in place, and the gear set is a little bit sloppy and a bit noisy. This is completely normal, and don't panic. All the gears actually look to be in perfect condition as far as the teeth go. Now this is the first and second gear synchro thingy, and I can slide it into first gear with some effort, which is good, and there appears to be positive engagement. Now back when we were having problems with this transmission popping out of the gear, there was positive engagement when putting the transmission in first gear, so that's very consistent. Now the reason I mentioned this is, there's a ball and spring under this doohickey that holds the synchro thingy in either first or second gear. Just by the way this feels, it appears the ball and spring are still good, and they're doing their job. Well, with my limited knowledge, I just don't see any red flags yet, so we need to dig deeper. Off camera, I pulled the first and second gear shift fork off the cover, and I want to see how it feels when it's in place. Yeah, it's a little sloppy, but keep in mind the plastic thingies are worn out, but they're still in place. Well, this is where real expertise is necessary, and unfortunately I just don't know how bad this really is. Alright, let's dig deeper. So at this point, we need to remove the doohickeys for fifth gear so we can pull the input shaft and the main shaft out of the case. So we need to punch this pin out on the shift fork. Now apparently it's possible to bend the fifth gear shift shaft, and it's recommended to put a deep socket under the pin, and that'll absorb the hammer blows when punching the pin out. Next we need to pull this snap ring. That wasn't too difficult. Okay, well the plastic thingies on this shift fork actually look pretty good, but keep in mind we weren't having a problem with fifth gear. So this thingy is a bit stuck, and I think we need to pull it with a cheapo gear puller. Yep, it's not taking much effort to pull this thing off. Meh, this thing ain't on my radar, so let's keep moving. The 5th gear shift rod comes out next. Now, this rod needs to rotate clockwise to disengage it, and then you can just pull it right out of the case. Okay, let's pull the front bearing support. Well, the race appears to be in excellent condition, and this roller bearing also seems fine. Now, this transmission didn't make any weird noises, so that makes sense. Anyway, to get this input shaft out of the case, you have to rotate it while lightly pulling on it, and eventually there's a clearance thingy on the input shaft that lines up with the cluster gear, and the shaft will pull right out of the case. So this is what I was talking about. This cutout needs to be pointed straight down in order for this shaft to come out of the case. Alright, the nose on this main shaft appears to be in perfect condition, and there's no galling on the bearing surface. So, this transmission is theoretically rebuildable for not much money. Anyway, now I can pull the main shaft out of the gearbox. Believe it or not, there's plenty of room to pull this shaft out from the top of the case. Well, inside the case, it's fairly clean, and the cluster gear seems fine. Again, I'm not seeing any red flags, or I just don't know what I'm looking at. Anyway, this is starting to look like a crime scene, so let me clean this up and I'll be right back. So off camera, I did some looking and I found what appears to be rust on the overdrive gear. That's not where our problem's at, but it's kind of telling us there may have been water in this transmission sometime in the past. Alright, well, let's be realistic. This non-world-class transmission is probably worth $200 to $300 on the open market if it's in usable condition. So we need to set a budget of no more than $200 to repair this thing. I think that's reasonable. The good news is, so far I haven't seen any red flags, but then again, I'm no expert. Now, Allstate Gear sells a kit with the standard rebuild parts for $160. This kit has the brass synchro rings and it has the plastic shift fork doohickeys, plus a bunch of other stuff that we may or may not need. Anyway, if we find stuff that's broken and it's not in this kit, well, that may be too much money to fix this transmission. So let's just fast forward to the problem area and then let the experts have a good look at the components for engaging first gear. So it took a few minutes to strip down the main shaft to just first gear. These are the components that hold first gear in place when selected, and this stuff looks okay to me. Now over on the gear itself, I'm not really sure what I'm looking at, but this seems okay to me, and what I mean by that is, this looks about the same as the rest of the gears in the transmission. The shifter hub thingy seems okay, and it looks exactly like the stuff I've seen online, so I'm not really sure where the problem was at. I reckon the brass synchro is questionable, but as I understand it, this is a synchro and its job is to synchronize the speed of the gears prior to engagement. I don't see how this would affect the engagement of first gear once it was shifted into first. Is it possible that a worn synchro would make the transmission pop out of first gear? I don't know. The ball and spring seem to be intact, and I don't think this was the problem. Now obviously I'm no expert, but I reckon there are qualified folks watching who have an opinion based on real experience. This transmission would pop out of first gear when the truck was accelerated, and it was possible to physically hold the shifter in first with a lot of effort, but without using a lot of effort, first gear was basically unusable. I really don't see what failed, and unfortunately I'm stumped. So I look forward to seeing what the experts think in the comment section. Now, if you're not an expert and you really want to know what the problem was, well, I'm going to go ahead and pin the best explanation I get. So look for the pinned comment. Well, we have a huge snowstorm on its way, and I need to get out of here because I can't walk on the snow with my crutches. We'll see you next time. Until then.